Hi, everyone, and welcome to our latest State of .NET webinar, .NET 5 and .NET 6 preview. Today, we're going to focus exclusively on the latest news, announcements, and developments surrounding .NET itself. Where are we at with .NET 5? What's on the horizon for .NET 6? What about the classic .NET Framework 4.8? My name is Jim Duffy, and I'm the Director of Business Development here at Code. I was a developer and training instructor back in the day, but I've been lured to the dark side now, and I'm responsible for the marketing and sales efforts for all of our Code services, including Code Magazine, of course, but Code is so much more than a magazine. Yes, Code Magazine is our flagship, and probably how you know about us, but our other divisions include Code Consulting, where we do custom software development projects, Code Training and Mentoring, and Code Staffing. Code Magazine is the leading software development magazine written by developers for developers. As a benefit for attending, all registered attendees who don't already subscribe will automatically receive a free digital Code Magazine subscription. I've also included a free subscription link here for you to freely share with others who couldn't make it to the webinar. Our continuing mission is to help people build better software. We're a Microsoft partner and provide a number of services, including building custom software solutions on-prem and in the cloud, modernizing legacy applications, educating developers, providing developer resources to augment your development team, and supporting and maintaining existing applications. Our team of expert developers and consultants are ready to help you with your project. Our very popular and in-demand free hour of code provides an opportunity for you and your team to meet with our handpicked expert team to discuss anything you could use our help with. Slots are limited, so reach out to me today about getting a free hour of code scheduled for you and or your team. No charge, no strings, no commitment, just free help from our code experts. If you like what you see today, or have seen in our prior webinars, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. We would like your feedback about this webinar in the form of a quick survey, and we're willing to pay $100 in the form of an Amazon e-card to one lucky attendee. A name will be drawn from the entire webinar's registered attendee list, and a completed survey is required to qualify for the e-card. If the name selected hasn't completed a survey, another name is selected, and so on. You don't want to be that person whose name is selected only to lose out because you failed to complete the survey, right? Right? The survey is very short, and you'll finish it in no time flat. The survey link is on the slide, and we'll post the survey link in the chat window as well. Just a quick shout out here about Fotino. Fotino is an open source project that the Code team is involved with that allows .NET developers to create native cross-platform applications using web development technologies. You can leverage your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript skills to create applications that run on Windows, Linux, and the Mac. It's like Electron, only smaller and much more lightweight. Learn more at tryfotino.io. The slides and recording of today's webinar, and all of our webinars, will be available on the State of .NET page on the Code website. I've included that link here. Our presenter today is Markus Egger. Markus is the big kahuna around here. He's Code President and Chief Software Architect, publisher of Code Magazine, international author and speaker, Microsoft Regional Director, excellent golfer, and all-around nice guy. If this is your first time attending one of our webinars, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us. If you've attended a webinar in the past, welcome back. Okay, you've heard enough from me. Thanks for listening. Take it away, Markus.
Thank you, Jim. Hello and welcome everyone, wherever you might be. I guess good morning, good afternoon. It's an exciting event for us. It's a first in a lot of ways. Why is that? Well, we've now been doing these online State of .NET events for almost a year and a half, and because of the pandemic, they have been mostly from our homes. I've spoken to you from my home in Hawaii, I've spoken to you from Europe, but for the first time, we are back at Code headquarters in Houston, Texas. We've been able to open up our office a few days ago, and it's definitely a major milestone for us and certainly a positive way forward. And that makes it quite exciting. So we're in the office, we got people around, and I'm very happy. I know some people around the world, you're not as far along yet with the pandemic situation, but I hope this can be a little bit of a light at the end of the tunnel for you and indicate that it will get better. So exciting news here. But let's get into it. So what do we have to talk about today? We are talking about .NET. Now, it's a little bit difficult to say what that means, what belongs to the topic of .NET and what surrounding technologies. The way I look at it today is we're going to take a look at .NET 6, a little bit at .NET 5, .NET 6 being the product that's on the horizon, .NET 5 being the currently released product, and the two really are very closely tied together, as we'll discover throughout this presentation. When we do .NET development, we need tools. I'll talk a little bit about Visual Studio 2022. We'll probably at some point focus more on that, but there's a few things I want to pick out and show you. We'll talk about language improvements. I guess when you talk about something like C#, that's not technically the same as talking about .NET, but C# is very closely tied to it. In fact, as we'll discover, the release schedule of C# is now completely in sync with certain versions of .NET. So we'll talk about that quite a bit. We'll talk about some of the new technologies around different types of development, APIs, Windows UIs, web UIs. Some of the developments also that came out of Windows 11. Last month, we talked about a build recap, where we talked about everything that happened at the Microsoft Build Conference. That was just over a month ago. And since then, Microsoft had the launch event, the live event, where they announced Windows 11. And some of the news around Windows 11 are very relevant for us as developers, so much so that we'll focus on Windows 11 in the future in one of the State of .NET events. But I also want to pick out some of the more important aspects of Windows 11 as they apply to a .NET developer and as they fit into this .NET overview topic. So that's the agenda that we have today. Now, if you have any questions, I have my minions now sitting over there in the next room, looking at what questions you're asking, and I'll try to respond to them directly, but also pass them along to me. So if you see me glance over here, I'm looking at my control monitor to see if there's any questions or other things coming in, and I'll either answer them right away or at the end of the presentation. So that's the overview, but let's get right into it because we have a lot to talk about. So let's talk about .NET 6 in general. What is .NET? What's the overall vision for .NET 6? And one way to look at this is by using its original code name, which was 1.NET. The idea of 1.NET is to merge all the different .NET technologies that were really going off in quite a few different directions. And there was the full framework, there was mobile stuff, there was IoT, small micro framework things. There was, of course, .NET Core that was originally a web development technology. And so we had these different frameworks and runtimes that started to kind of compete with each other. And they had their purpose, but it fragmented the .NET space. So the vision for 1.NET was to reunite all of that into a single .NET environment and runtime, and whatever worked on .NET was supposed to work everywhere within reason. I mean, there's still some scenarios, you know, if you're calling to something that's Windows OS specific from within .NET 6, that'll only work on Windows, obviously, and not on some kind of mobile device. Or if you're accessing a camera on a mobile device, that's not going to work on a web-based server environment, for instance. So there's logical limitations, but there shouldn't be any platform limitations as such. And that was the vision for 1.NET. And originally, this was meant to be implemented with .NET 5. Now, there was a variety of reasons why that didn't happen in .NET 5. Certainly the COVID pandemic crisis was one of those. There's probably other reasons too. It was a big workload, to say the least. So there's probably other reasons why it didn't all happen in .NET 5. But .NET 6 really completes that journey. And some of the things you'll hear me say today, you've probably heard me say in earlier State of .NETs around .NET 5, because the vision is the same. In a way, .NET 6 is where it comes full circle and where what was originally planned for .NET 5 is really being realized as the final .NET 1.NET vision. So an interesting milestone that's coming up here, and certainly a huge step forward. Okay. So just looking back at the history a little bit, I don't want to do a big history lesson, but just a quick glance at this. the .NET journey has now been going on for over 2 decades. The earliest alpha and beta versions of .NET came out in 1999, I think. So a long road, lots of twists and turns, lots of changes in the marketplace. What was important back then certainly isn't important in a cloud-based, distributed, team-oriented world. And some of the things that are important now don't fit as well into the original into the original vision. In particular, scaling and having microservices and small things, and how do you run those side by side, and containerization, all those things clearly weren't on the horizon originally, even in anyone's dreams. So .NET got re-envisioned. That's where we had .NET Core, and now the .NET Core grew all these new .NET flavors. And looking back, now we've had quite a few. We had the full .NET framework and runtime. We had .NET Core. We then had the mono runtime that could run on non-Windows environments, and then Xamarin grew out of that. We had the detour through the UWP and Metro apps starting in Windows 8. Silverlight came and went. Windows Phone came and went. So you see we had all these different flavors, and the reunification of that is basically taking the best of all those worlds and putting them on a modern platform that's based on .NET Core. So when we talk about .NET 5, .NET 6, we're really talking about .NET Core, except we don't call it that anymore. It's now assumed that it's on top of this new environment, and we just call it .NET. And it really doesn't matter what version or what flavor of .NET you're using. It's now all one thing. That's the different big news that we now have. Okay. So comparing it to relatively recent things, say .NET Core 3.1 and .NET Standard, those are things that are still as viable today, but they're just kind of a given now. When you build a new .NET app, it's based on those standards, and you don't have to worry about what runs where anymore. So that's kind of really nice. Now it's also explaining why we needed older things to be brought forward. Some people say, well, why is it that the Windows technologies like WinForms were brought forward? Is there a really big benefit? And there's benefits, they're more in the details, but the huge benefit is you're part of the modern platform with that sort of thing, and everything going forward, the new APIs, the bug fixes, the new OSs, the cross-platform nature, all of that now becomes available within those environments as well. And it's important to not be on a dead end with a lot of that stuff. So looking at the timeline and roadmap for where we are and where we are going with .NET, we are currently on .NET 5. That's the latest released version. At this point, realistically speaking, you should probably use .NET 5 for your production environments. .NET 5 was released last November, and we did 2 State of .NET events around that. You can still go back and watch those online if you want to look at a lot of those details. So that is the version that I recommend you use today. Now you can start using .NET 6, which is available as a preview. But some of the real benefits in .NET 6 are still a little rough, as you'll see today in this presentation. So you're really getting a lot of the benefits with .NET 5, but .NET 6 will turn into something that you should probably use for production here in the relatively near future, probably before its official release, even if you were a little adventurous. But the official release of .NET 6 will be on November 9th, 2021. So we are now on this annual release cadence. And Microsoft is doing kind of an interesting on and off type of switch, where one version is considered a general availability version. It's a truly released product. It's fully supported, but it's not supported as long as every other version. And so .NET 6 will be what we call long-term support. And the difference between that is basically it should be easy to go from .NET 5 to .NET 6, and therefore everybody should then move to .NET 6, and .NET 5 support is going to run out a little sooner, and .NET 6 is going to be longer term support. So a little bit of a difference in the support time frame, but that's not to be confused with no support. .NET 5 certainly is a fully supported product by Microsoft. Now, a lot of people, by the way, also ask, well, what about the older versions of .NET? I'm still on the traditional or legacy, whatever you want to call it, version of .NET, like .NET Framework 4.8, for instance. Well, those components are tied to the operating system. So 4.8 ships with Windows, will ship with Windows 11, and therefore the support cycle resets with that, and it's also a fully supported product. But don't expect any big news there. The big news is in .NET 5 and .NET 6, and that's where you'll see your new things happening. So anyway, major releases every year, very predictable fashion. Now you may say, how can Microsoft guarantee that they'll do these releases every year? What if things get delayed? Wouldn't be the first time something gets delayed in software. Well, the basic idea is one releases what they have at that point. So .NET 5, you could argue, was delayed. Nevertheless, it still got shipped with the features that were ready, and that's what we'll see going forward as well. Now that doesn't mean that there's half-baked stuff in there, but it's just some things like the new Xamarin cross-platform apps that we'll talk about today just weren't in there yet, and you could get them as preview bits but not as fully released general availability or long-term support bits. Now in between, Microsoft may also release minor releases that are bug fixes, security related things and so on, so those will still happen. But on this roadmap here we see the major milestones that we have in our timeline. Now, like I said, .NET 6 will release in November, but previews are currently available. We are currently on preview 5 for .NET 6. So that's a fairly major or fairly far into this preview cycle. And a lot of things are pretty stable. There's one or two technologies that are still a little rough. We'll talk about that. There are also some of the major things that they're working on, so no surprise. The bigger projects are the ones that still require more work. But that's available. You can download that. You can run it side by side with your current version of .NET, so you don't need a separate machine to try this stuff out. It's perfectly fine to put this on your main developer machine because it doesn't hurt your current installation of .NET 5 or other earlier versions of .NET. So that's side by side is perfectly safe there. We also have Visual Studio 2022 available in preview. That just recently became available. Before that, it was actually called Visual Studio 2019 Preview, which was a little confusing because we already had a released version of 2019, and then that was the preview of what comes after 2019, I guess was the idea there. But now we have Visual Studio 2022 available as a preview, and that's actually quite nice. It's a pretty cool preview, and I enjoy using that quite a bit, and we'll take a look at that as well. So a lot of people say, well, .NET 5 versus .NET 6, why would I choose one or the other? Again, .NET 6 is really the completion of what this journey was supposed to be. So once .NET 6 is out, there's no question you should just move to .NET 6. There should be no difficulty in upgrading. You're just changing the version in your project, and it should run all the same. So there's no incompatible type of things in there. So very, very easy upgrade path. So once that's available, just switch to .NET 6 and finally we get to that full vision realized. I also want to talk a little more about this general availability, GA, versus long-time support, LTS, because there seems to be a lot of confusion about that. Again, I want to stress that the GA versions are still fully supported versions, so you shouldn't stay off of .NET 5 because it's not an LTS version. It just means that once .NET 6 ships, it's easy to upgrade to .NET 6. You should go to .NET 6 and then just move on that way. And support for .NET 5 as such will then run out, so you shouldn't expect to see .NET 5 on Azure for a long time after .NET 6 was released, or at least those servers should be upgraded. And that's not going to be a hard task. So the GA versions are supported 15 months. And so that means with a 1-year release cadence, there's going to be a 3-month overlap. Now, it's not going to stop working if you keep using it longer, but it's recommended that you just flip the switch, go to 6, and then that will be supported for 3 years. And then, of course, the next versions kick in, and we fully expect that that'll be an easy upgrade as well. So, long story short, both versions, whether it's GA or LTS, are perfectly fine to use in production, are perfectly supported. It's just one is supported longer than the other. Now, what does it mean to have a unified .NET platform? And this is actually a slide that I used when I talked about .NET 5 because the story hasn't changed. The idea is we have one version of .NET. There's one runtime. There's one set of features that you can use. You don't have to worry anymore about what works where other than platform-specific things. So, for instance, gaming is supported here. If you are doing a game, you can interact with a controller like an Xbox controller. Obviously, that's not going to work if you're building, say, an IoT app that doesn't have a controller attached. So logical limitations apply, but in terms of just the overall framework, the classes, the properties, you're not going to have these arbitrary differences that you had in the past, where you had to really pay attention to what's available where. So it should be a standard platform that's based on .NET Standard, except you're not worrying about that so much anymore. And then it has shared infrastructure. The compilers, the languages, the runtime components are shared across everything. And then on top of that sits desktop development, web development, cloud development, and its various incarnations and technologies. Mobile development cross-platform for iOS and Android through the Xamarin story. Gaming through Xbox. I'm not going to talk about that very much today because we are not a gaming event. But gaming is important, has some important news too. For instance, the game developer kit that used to be available in very limited fashion to only specific companies that had to jump through all kinds of hoops to get there. That's now available to everyone. You can get it from GitHub. So very cool development there if you're into that. IoT devices, of course, are becoming more and more important all the time and have been pretty important for a while now. And of course, we got all the AI stuff, whether that's machine learning on Azure, whether that's ML.NET or all those things. They're all just sitting on top of the shared platform now and are available everywhere and take advantage of the same compilers, the same memory management optimizations and all kinds of things that really best of breed brought together in a single platform. For instance, memory management in Mono was really good, so they brought some of that into the platform. Now everybody benefits from that, so very nice. And then of course we have tooling, and the tooling works across the board. So we have of course Visual Studio, which is what we'll talk about today. We have Visual Studio Code, which is an excellent editor for all code-driven editing, so not so much visual designers or no visual designers, but writing text basically, really good editor for that. And then finally we have things like Visual Studio for the Mac, a little bit of a more of a niche product, but that's also getting upgraded and modernized and is a fully supported product that's fairly popular with the Mac crowd. And then we of course have all the command line interface stuff that works across the board. So all these tools can be one set of tooling for all these platforms. We don't have to create, say, different compiler integration because you want to run on Xamarin versus, say, an IoT device. Okay, we have a question online. How long will the .NET Framework 4.8 be supported? It goes with the Windows support cycle. So it's part of Windows as the operating system, and that goes for some other things too that we'll talk about today, like the web view controls that come from Edge. And therefore they will be supported however long that version of Windows is supported. So I don't know what the exact years are, but it's a long period of time. So no worry about that running out. At the same time, you'll get things like bug fixes, security fixes, that sort of stuff. Don't expect any major new APIs or new features, anything like that becoming available in 4.8. It is what it is. It'll keep functioning as that. But if you're learning about this great new Azure API or containerization technique or anything, and I'm just making up stuff here, don't expect those to come to 4.8. 4.8 is what it is, right? So a little more information about the health of the .NET ecosystems. I have a few slides here that I just stole, or let's call it borrowed from Microsoft. Didn't steal it, they gave them to me, but they're not my slides, but just a little bit of information from them just to communicate to you how healthy the .NET ecosystem is. Because a lot of the stuff that's happened around .NET over the last few years really gave the platform a nice push and an upward tick, or more than a tick in popularity. So we have over 5 million active Visual Studio developers. So these are not people that bought Visual Studio or .NET at some point and then installed it and never used it. These are developers that are continuously active, and that number, this slide's a little bit old, maybe 6 months, so it's probably more than that at this point. It gets great reviews in terms of how much people like it. It has a lot going on around open source. Microsoft has now become the biggest open source contributor there is. We have C# as a super popular language, top 5 continuously or consistently in GitHub surveys. We have great performance in .NET. That's always something that depends a little bit on how you measure it, and different benchmarks highlight different things, and I guess it depends exactly on who did it and what they really wanted to show. The bottom line is the .NET Core family and everything continuing from there, including of course .NET 5 and 6, are very, very fast components and a very, very fast platform. Again, 7 times faster than Node.js is one of those milestones that Microsoft hit. Some will measure it a little slower, some will measure it considerably faster. The point is, it's a very performant platform, and it's getting better and better with every release. So looking at .NET 6, we have some really interesting performance improvements around general behavior, but also around technologies such as Entity Framework Core that's considerably been sped up again. And so every single version of .NET just gets a little faster, and they performance optimize it. So bottom line takeaway here is it's very fast and performant. So if you're worried about that and scalability, then that's definitely a good point for .NET. And you should be worried about performance and scalability at this point. Now, another interesting point that I find very interesting is .NET and the Microsoft platform in general always had a very hard time with students and startups and just the new people coming into the market. And .NET, starting with .NET Core, really kind of turned that around a little bit, and we now see much more uptake with students and new projects and just people that, for a while it wasn't hip to be on .NET, and it's hip again, so that's nice. Another way to look at performance, again, I'm not even going to go into a lot of those details here, but you can find a lot of data. There's some URLs in here where you can read more. And these slides, by the way, are going to be available for download after this event on the Stata.net website. So you can go and look at those URLs and do a little more research on that. But the bottom line is it's fast. Right? If you're worried about performance, it's definitely a good thing. .NET adoption, like I said, goes very fast. So we have some additional interesting facts here. So if you have to go to your manager and justify why you want to use .NET, these are some good slides for you that are probably useful. So I'm not even going to say a whole lot more about that, but I wanted them to be in here in this presentation. Now, as I said, the .NET 6 release will happen in November. More accurately, November 9th through 11th is this year's .NET Conf. That's Microsoft's annual online event around .NET, and it's always being used now as the launch event. So that'll be the official .NET 6 launch, and you'll be able to go online and partake completely free of charge in this event. Another side note, we published a magazine entirely focusing on .NET 5. So if you want to kind of read soup to nuts what's in .NET 5, then check out this Code Focus issue. It's available free online. I'm not trying to sell you anything here. It's just available to you. This is something we produced together with Microsoft. So a lot of Microsoft people were the actual authors in this issue. And like I said, you can get it free online. All the subscribers actually got an issue, a printed issue in the mail. It's available in our mobile apps and all that. So check that out. It'll give you a lot of good information about .NET 5. That's also, of course, applicable to .NET 6 because, again, .NET 5 and .NET 6 make up this one full story that we used to call one.NET. Now, I don't have anything to announce about a special issue for .NET 6 yet, but as you can imagine, as a publisher who's done special issues focusing on every version of .NET recently, we are probably looking at that very closely. So if you are a subscriber, and let's say hypothetically we were to do a .NET 6 issue, and you wanted to get that in the mail, you would automatically get it as a subscriber. If you're not a subscriber yet, click this link and you'll get a free subscription, and that's a good way to get that magazine. But again, it's also available online, and you can just go to the CodeMag website and look up all the articles there. All right, let's dive into it a little more. Let's talk about Visual Studio 2022. That's our tool that we'll use to do a lot of the .NET things. along with Visual Studio Code. But Visual Studio 2022 is where the news are at this point, so I'm going to talk about that. So what is Visual Studio 2022? Well, it's the next version of Visual Studio, and it's very much in line with what you always think of when you hear about a new version of Visual Studio. It's geared towards working best with the latest APIs and SDKs and version of Azure and all that, and it certainly does exactly that. On top of it, there's some really interesting news here. One of them is that for the first time, Visual Studio is now a native 64-bit application. And what that means is it'll take better advantage of a large memory space. It eliminates a lot of the bottlenecks that we had in Visual Studio performance-wise. It'll be drastically faster in loading especially large projects with tons of files. And it'll be generally faster as a lot of interop and various limitations in how it works with certain designers and so on were removed. So just key takeaway is overall much faster and performant, especially in machines with a lot of memory, which a lot of developer machines are. So that's nice. The look has been updated a little bit. There's new icons, you kind of see that here. There's a new dark color theme, so a little bit of a modernization going on. It's still Visual Studio, right? Visual Studio is an app with a lot of tradition, which is the polite way to say it's been around for a while. And so it still has that traditional look, but it's been modernized a little bit. And that's certainly nice and welcome on top of the performance improvements. Now, one of the key focus areas of Visual Studio, of course, is always productivity. And in this case, it's around, a lot of it is around debugging, which I really like. So there's a lot of other things you could talk about, but that's one of the areas that I really enjoy in Visual Studio 2022. Debugging and productivity, and especially how you can interact with your code while Visual Studio is running. And then there's also this other thing called AI IntelliCode that we'll talk about, which is more and more machine learning and AI is making it directly into Visual Studio and helping you write your code. So let's take a look at some of this. Let's start with hot reload. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go into Visual Studio here. And so this is Visual Studio 2022, the start screen, and we'll create a new project here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a simple WinForms app just to show that that also works. And there's a question online is how do I migrate from Visual Studio 2019 to 2022? You don't really migrate. It's just a tool that you can use interchangeably. It just works. So there's no, the project structure doesn't change or anything like that, because the project structure is not driven by Visual Studio anymore. It's driven by the .NET platform, and Visual Studio 2022 is just one of the tools that works in the .NET platform. Did I say COM interop has been removed from Visual Studio 2022? No, if that it came across like that, then that if I was confusing about that, I apologize. Interop has not been removed. In fact, what happens inside of Visual Studio is Visual Studio is a Win32 app, but it interacts with other things like WPF-based designers and all kinds of other stuff. And not being 64-bit has led to bottlenecks there. And now, because it's 64-bit, the performance of all of that has been improved, but certainly all still there. So I'm just gonna create a WinForms app here. And I'm gonna put it on .NET 6 preview, of course, which is the default in Visual Studio 2022. And I'm using the dark theme, as you'll see. In fact, there's two different dark themes in Visual Studio 2022. I usually like new looks and other things. But in this case, I actually like the traditional dark theme better, I have to admit. So anyway, here is Visual Studio loading a WinForms designer. If you've used Visual .NET 5, you already know, even in an old technology like WinForms, the designer works. This is restoring a bunch of stuff first time around. This usually takes a little bit. And then my streaming setup also slows things down a little. So you'll probably see this happening a little bit faster. And I'll show you some other ways of creating these project types. And as sometimes is the case in presentations, takes particularly long this time. So let's give it a moment. There we go. And so we got our designer, we got our toolbox that's still loading here. And you'll do this at home and you'll see it probably goes in an instant, so kind of messing with me a little bit. There we go. And so all of that is fully supported. We got a nice designer here, and we could drop a button on, and we can of course double click, and so all of that works across the board. And now let's do something in here, like something really simple. I'll zoom in a little more. So I'm just going to do messagebox.show. Gotta have a Hello World app. And so we'll go ahead and run that right out of Visual Studio. Of course, if you're a command line guy, you could do that as well. If you're a Visual Studio Code guy, you could edit the code, but you don't have the visual designers, but you could still edit, you could still run. In fact, we now have several older WinForms projects that we brought forward into the .NET 5 world at this point. And we do a lot of it just with code editing and not so much with the visual designers anymore, and that works fine as well. So here's our app, and as you can imagine, I can click that button and here's the Hello World. And now what's really cool is I can come in here and I can say, you know what, I didn't want to say Hello World here, but I really wanted to say Hello Markus. And I saved that. Now our app is still up and running here, but now we have this cool button up here called Apply Code Changes. And I can click that and go back to my application and click that button again, and you see that it now says Hello Markus. So it took those changes that I had and it applied them on the fly, and it didn't take down my debug scenario, and it didn't lose the state of everything. It just on the fly patched those code changes into the running application. And my code changes take immediately and just work. And that's just super productive. It's a little feature. And it's this kind of feature where like, oh, I've known edit and continue before, and then that was kind of cute, but in my scenarios didn't really work, and so it wasn't really useful for me. Was kind of the typical scenario. But with this, this is called Hot Reload. This is just a much more useful feature. So if you have a large app and you need to go into the app and then navigate and load data, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I want to make this little change and see what it does. Hot Reload is just awesome. Right? It just totally preserves the state, and it works in complex scenarios, and just a great feature all around. So it's a little thing, but productivity-wise, to me, it's just really nice. Okay, a few more questions online. People say, I said Visual Studio consumes a lot of memory. What is that? Well, there's no hard number. It's just Visual Studio. In a way, it's a hog, because it just takes it, as much memory as it can grab. But on the other hand, it takes advantage of the memory, right? And a 64-bit app, of course, tends to be more memory hungry, can address a bigger memory space. And so I don't have an exact number as to what that means, but it just can take advantage of machines with a lot more memory. And these days, a lot of developers have 32 gigs, 64 gigs, right? So let's have it take advantage for it. Will VS 2022 have a SAML designer for WinUI? Yeah, it has a SAML designer, and then it brings in whatever UI components you have. So it depends a little bit on the platform. And so you can design WinUI 3 elements in SAML, but how deep you can get into it, of course, is a little bit of a different question. Another question is, I have VS 2019 preview installed. Can I install VS 2022 over that, basically? Yes, you can. I have, on this machine, which is my production machine, I have regular Visual Studio 2019, and even I think 2017 still installed. I have the 2019 preview, and I have 2022 preview. And you can run all of those side by side. I don't use 2019 anymore, so I'll be deinstalling that. The 2019 preview. I'll be uninstalling that, and that should still work fine. All right, so that's Hot Reload, and again, this works with really complex scenarios, so that's really nice. So that's a little feature I wanted to point out. Another feature that I'm really excited about is Visual Studio AI IntelliCode. What this is, it's the ability to have AI support you in writing code. So it does things like auto-completion and refactorings. And the easiest way to play with this is to just use it and write something. Let me zoom in a little more yet, make sure you can see that. So let's do something else in here, like we create a person class, let's say, and then we do a first name and a last name. So we have something to play with. And then let's say we come up here and we say var p1 equals a new person. All right, and var p2. And note that while I'm typing this, my cursor is right here. I hope you can see that in the stream. It's right after the equal sign. And then you see here in gray, it puts in some code that it thinks you are most likely to type. So this is almost like autocomplete IntelliSense, except it's not the drop-down menu that we are used to. That's still there, and you can use that. But it's AI sitting on top of it, analyzing my project, and says, hey, I think this is what you're most likely to do. And if you're fine with this, then hit tab. And it understands that, you know, if I want to create a new person, I'll probably want to set the first name, because that's what I've done before. It doesn't know what I want to set the property to, so I'll just do that. But so it's smart about it, and it's not just smart about, say, code that Microsoft wrote or framework elements. It's smart about the code that you create and classes you create, because it's not hard-coded, it's AI doing this, right? So that's really cool, and you know, we could then do whatever. So it even tries to come up with other things I might want to do here, right? But let's say console dot write and say p1 dot first name. Let's put in a line feed. A question online is, will that AI feature also be available in VS Code? And that's a really good question. I don't know the answer to that. I wouldn't be surprised if it showed up at some point, but I haven't heard any announcements about that at this point. But what makes sense to me, so we'll see what happens there. So anyway, I just added some more code in here, right? I did a console.write, and I did something that's kind of a little odd, but it will work, right? So I just added a line feed at the end of console.write, and we could now run that, of course. And it says, hey, you want to enable IntelliSense? Yeah, that's fine. Go away. And now let's say I want to fix that, right? So people are probably screaming at me online now and say, why are you doing console.write and then a line feed at the end? What you should do is you should really do a console.write line. And I'm going to do that, and I'm going to take out that R and N here, and then I'm going to do the same here. And then I'm going down here, and now you'll see we got this little screwdriver symbol showing up, and I can click that to see what it wants to do. And nope, it's not doing what I expected it to do. Let's give it maybe one more. There we go. And now what we have here is we have a suggestion, right? So it says, hey, I think you want to do this. I think you want to change your next 6 instances of that console.write to console.write line and remove that line feed at the end. So what we're doing here is we are refactoring code. We're using a Visual Studio refactoring, but this is not a refactoring that exists in Visual Studio. It was AI that observed me making that change 2 or 3 times, and then on the fly creating an intelligent refactoring saying, hey, you probably want to do this more often now that I've seen you do this a few times. And so it on the fly comes up with these refactorings that really make it a lot easier for me to change these large stretches of code. And who hasn't done this where you have lines and lines of code, and you did something in some way, and now you know to do it better, or something new has come around, and you're just going through line after line after line doing this repetitive, stupid task. And now you don't have to do that anymore. Visual Studio AI is now smart enough to pick that up and say, hey, I want to apply this new refactoring that nobody's ever seen before, but that just came up with based on observing what I did. So I think that's just super cool for a variety of reasons. I think it's going to make me so much more productive with a lot of this stuff. Also, I think it's just a super cool use of AI. And a lot of people always go, well, I don't know how I would use AI or why I would really need it. Well, AI is now everywhere, and there's really very few scenarios where you couldn't think, if you tried hard, you'd find a way to use AI to improve it. And this is a perfect example to me, right? This is not something that we would have said 2 or 3 years ago that, oh my God, we really need this. But now that it's here, it's like, wow, this is cool, and it'll make me just so much more productive. So I'm excited about this, in case you can tell. I think these 2 features I just showed you are little features, hot reload, the AI, they're little features, but to me, they're productivity-wise so significant that I wanted to take the time to point them out to you today. Visual Studio Code we talked about briefly. I just wanted to mention that here. In Stata.NET events, I'm always supposed to do a good overview of everything, and then when I leave something out, people are like, oh my God, is that not important anymore? It's like, no, Visual Studio Code is still super important. I use it all the time. It's an excellent, excellent code editor, and I expect to use it for that in the future as well. I really like it. The community really likes it. I'm not going to talk about this more today, but it's still super important. It's just like I don't have enough time to talk about Visual Studio Code today. Moving away from Visual Studio, let's talk more about the .NET 6 platform in general, and what are the main new things in .NET 6 over .NET 5. First of all, we have C# 10 in .NET 6, and that aims to simplify your code base. So there's always, with every new version of C#, there's kind of a theme that the C# team picks. And this time it's simplifying the code base. So looking at what we do in C#, is there fluff in there? How can you make a developer more productive, make him write less code, make him create code that's easier to read, all that sort of stuff. So we'll take a look at some of that. Another scenario that .NET 6 really wants to take care of is building what's called minimal web APIs. When you build microservices, APIs with microservices, a lot of them are very small, and that's one of the characteristics they're called microservices, right? They're small, and so they're self-contained small units, and they shouldn't be hard to create, especially when they're really on the small side of things. And so we have a lot of fluff in .NET in prior versions, that when you create something that just runs as a lambda or a function or as a small service in a container or something like that, it's like, well, why do I have to do this all the time? So that's kind of a theme that I see in general in architecture and development today, is smaller and smaller units that are replaceable, interchangeable, throw away relatively soon, probably trying to get away from having a lot of technical debt and making it more replaceable. And so supporting that scenario is very interesting. So we will take a look at what minimal web APIs are like. Then we have what we call Maui. I love the code name because I live in Maui, but it doesn't stand for the name of the island. It stands for multi-platform app UIs. And what that is basically cross-platform, rich client, desktop apps, whatever you want to call them. They run on Windows, they run on the Mac, they run on iOS, they run on Android. So a true multi-platform app, and that's built on top of the infrastructure that the Xamarin guys have been working on. Except Xamarin in the past was more Android and iOS. Yes, could do some other things, but those things were fringe and kind of fell by the wayside. And now with the new version, the goal is to make it truly cross-platform and work well everywhere. So we'll talk about that a little bit. Blazor, we've talked a lot about Blazor before. Blazor is red hot, a very, very popular topic. And Blazor has now been around for a few versions, has matured, is stable, clearly here to stay, very popular with the community. And Blazor can do different things. It can build web apps, and it can build web apps that run in the browser using this thing called WebAssembly. They can also run on the server using back and forth communication through SignalR. And this has now been extended to also allow building Blazor desktop apps. Now the obvious question there is, well, now we have Blazor cross-platform desktop apps, we have Maui cross-platform desktop apps. We'll talk about the differences there as well, so bear with me there. Okay. And then there's other things that are important, like more devices we can target, better ARM support, better deployment, smaller deployment files, performance improvements. So in a way, the things you would expect from every new version of .NET continues on here as well. Okay. Again, we talked about performance. I have one slide here kind of as a representative slide, and that is Entity Framework Core, which if you've never used that, that's for data access. And that's been improved drastically. Okay, so there's .NET improvements on the platform. There's also improvements specific to that set of components. But that's representative for what Microsoft's aiming for, is just considerable improvements in performance. And .NET 5 had considerable improvements over the prior platform, and the prior platform was already very fast and had considerable improvements. So you get the idea, right? It's this performance and scalability is very important for Microsoft, and they're doing very well with this. Now let's talk about the languages, and we've talked about languages before, especially if you go back and watch the state of .NETs around .NET 5. We've talked about things like F#, that's still there. We've talked about things like Visual Basic, the ability to write core or .NET 5 and 6 app with Visual Basic is there, which is important if you have an older code base and you want to bring it forward. In .NET Core, the original versions, you couldn't use VB. Well, that was problematic because now you had an old code base, and how do you move forward? So those things are supported. I'm not talking about it much today, but VB is certainly still there, and F# is certainly an important piece of the puzzle. But it's clear that C# is the most popular .NET language. So we'll talk about C# today. And what's interesting about C# is that the team is now completely in sync with .NET. Now you say, well, that was kind of true before. It's like, yes and no. C# was kind of a language independent of .NET. Now C# is truly releasing with .NET versions, specifically also to enable certain things that are important for that .NET version. And if you build a .NET 5 app, that .NET 5 app will by default use the C# 9 compiler. And if you're building a .NET 6 app, then that'll automatically choose the C# 10 compiler. You could fiddle with that, but usually you don't. It's just the versions are more closely aligned, I should say. And so C# 9 shipped with .NET 5, C# 10 with .NET 6, and so on. You get the idea. And again, all of that plays into that one .NET story where we are really meshing the .NET 5 and 6 story together. So let's take a look, starting with C# 9. Again, I talked a lot about that in the state of .NET's focusing on C#, but just a quick recap here. Simplification was already a topic in C# 9, and one of those was top-level statements. If you look at a simple app, a console app, or a very simple service this could be, they usually look something like this. You bring in namespaces, you declare your own namespace, you create a class, you create a static void main, and at the end of the day, you're like, well, all I'm saying here is I want to do a write line on the console. Do I really need 10 lines of code for that? And the answer is you don't need all of that, right? So C# 9 made it much simpler by basically allowing you to do this. They just say using system, console.writeLine, and the namespace declaration, a class, the main function, all of that is not necessary. These two things are functionally almost identical. We are not defining the hello world namespace, but other than that, this is functionally identical and just makes it simpler to write small pieces of code. Again, microservices, functions, lambdas, and so on come to mind. So that's nice. Another thing that's nice is record types. A record is a special type of class that basically becomes an immutable class. So I just wrote that class called person in my prior example. I could have done that as a record, and the record would have been, almost the same syntax. I could have said, instead of class, I could have said record. And then what's different here is that this becomes immutable. So if I then tried to say, oops, go away. Let's say p1.first name is something else. That would not be allowed because it's a record. Okay, so these things are immutable, and you get different behavior in comparing them. So if you compare two records, they're not pointer-based comparison. They are actually looking at the individual properties, and if they are the same value, then the equals operation would be true, for instance. It's easy to clone them, and just a nice additional way. It's really a class under the hood, but it's a special type of class that just works nice for things like multi-threaded asynchronous environments and so on. So a truly welcome and nice addition. Along with that goes things like init-only setters to truly make that immutability work and so on. So if you're interested in that, go back to my Stata.NET 5 presentation. I have samples for all of that. Another thing is enhanced pattern matching. So if you're into pattern matching, like those features in C#, we have an enhanced version of that. And then simplifications like this, where it's just more concise syntax. I declare a variable x of type person x, and then I just say new, and well, what's that gonna be? It's probably a new person, right? So you don't actually have to specifically declare that anymore. It's kind of like the opposite angle from a var keyword. So things like that, right? Go back to the Stata.NET for .NET 5 and take a look at this. So what's new in C#10? Well, it's a continuation of a lot of those things. One is required initializers. So if I have this person here and I say, okay, this can only be set during initialization, I can actually in C#10 make that required, and it's not fully supported by the editor yet, but that's how that's going to work. And then if I was to leave out my initialization of the last name, it would highlight that here. Again, the editor experience is not quite there yet, but that's what that does, right? You're forced to initialize that. Let's get rid of this. So that's required initializers. Another thing that is a small feature, but I really love it, is this ability to use the set keyword. So let's say you wanted to do something like this. Let's say we have a regular class here, and we have a first name, and we do a get set. And now what I want to do is in the set, I actually want to add a little bit of functionality, kind of like this, where I want to say the value equals value.trim, let's say. And then I want to assign that. Well, what I have to do now is, because I want to add some little bit of behavior, I now have to create a full backing field, right? I have to go and say whatever, private string first name, for instance. And then I can say first name equals value.trim. And now, of course, I have to return first name. And all of a sudden, this really simple property turned into whatever 10 lines of code. What I can do in C#10 is basically get rid of this and go back to that, and then just say field equals value.trim. And then field always refers to whatever internal backing field C# creates. So again, the editor is not happy with this yet, but that's what the syntax is going to be like in C#10. So it's just another simplification that keeps me from writing a lot of code. We got null parameter checking. If I have a method, for instance, that takes this string parameter called foo, I can declare that it cannot be null by passing in these, or by writing it with these 2 exclamation points. And then I don't have to do null checking in my method anymore, and I need to send something to it that can't be null. So again, saves us a little bit of code. Here's a feature that I really like: global using statements. We have a lot of cases where you have all these usings here, and I don't need a lot of them, but I need 2 of them. Now, when you look at these 2 using statements here that we've created in our Windows Forms application, it's like, well, if we build a WinForms app, we will probably need at least these two using statements everywhere. And so it makes sense to say, well, let's not declare them here, but let's go somewhere in our solution, say program.cs would work, and we put it in here. But we put them in as global usings. And now they're just going to be available everywhere in the application, and I don't have to specify them again in each and every file I do. So just a simplification of these files. And then finally, namespace declarations. When you look at most files, we always have this namespace declaration in here, and then everything else is indented and so on. And it is extremely rare in C# to see a file that has another namespace. Like it could theoretically do this, namespace 2 or whatever, and have a different namespace in the same file. But in the real world, you almost never see this, and if you do see this, I would kind of question whether you shouldn't break that out into 2 different files. But as a result, we now have this indentation with extra lines of code. So in C# 10, what you can do is this. You can just say namespace semicolon, and then go like that, and just remove the open close curlies. Again, the editor is not happy with me here, but that's how that's going to work. So single line namespace declarations with semicolons at the end. So just a nice simplification. So with this, we can go back to our old sample here, look at that, and this was C# 9. In C# 10, we could write that like this. We could somewhere in our whole setup have a global using statement for system, and this could be created by the template, right? So most likely you'll never actually touch or see this. And then we could actually write everything that we had here, including the namespace declaration, just like this. So that's a nice simplification. I like it a lot, and especially for simple things, really, really nice. Okay. Now another thing that I think is really nice in C# 10 and .NET 6 is what's called minimal APIs. And the idea behind minimal APIs is that you'll be able to just create web services, REST-based services, really, really simple. And rather than looking at that here, let's just fire up a terminal. Here's my Windows terminal. And let's go to my test folder. And let's do a .NET new. So this is, if you've never used the command line, this is another way of creating new .NET projects. I've shown you the one in Visual Studio 2022 where you just say new project and you use a template. We could do the same thing here. So we could do a new web project, give it a name. Simple web stata.net, for instance. And this is going to go and it's going to create a template for us. In this case, an empty ASP.NET Core template. And we could now open, let's just go to Visual Studio since we have it running. We could use Visual Studio Code, of course, but let's just open that here. There's the file I just created. And sure. And here's the simple web project. And when you look at this, this is kind of cool. So in here, we have very, very little code. It just says, create an app, basically, enable a few features here, like showing a developer exception page, which, we probably don't even need that. So you could remove that if you wanted it to be real concise. But then the more interesting part is here. We just say, hey, app, map a certain route, in this case just the root of the website, to a function. And what does this function do? Well, it just returns a string in this case. Now, so we could go ahead and we could run that. And this is all there is, right? This is all the code we have. You see how concise that is. And so we run it. It fires up a web server here. And it's now listening, running a browser, and it just goes to that URL, and boom, there it is. It just returns hello world. So this is not a full website. If you looked at the source, this is literally all it returned. But we could now do some more interesting things, right? We could say, let's map something else. I call this test, for instance, so that's what our URL is. And in this case, we return an object, and now we just say return a new object, and we'll give it some properties. In fact, not return, just like that. And we say first name is Markus. And what did I just do wrong here? Somewhere I gotta... There you go. And so we're just creating an anonymous object with two properties. I could have created a class, of course, and returned that class. And so we'll run that again, and this will show us our hello world root page. And then we just go to /test. And here is our object that automatically got converted to JSON and returned for us. And so it's just a super simple way of creating services, and then whatever goes on inside the services is just full-blown .NET. So I say these are super simple services, but these services could grow much, much more sophisticated and complex. So you could do whatever you want with that. And so a nice way to create services that eliminates a lot of this overhead and goes along well with this philosophy of .NET 6 and C# 10 of building simple things. Question was online was do the global usings only work in WinForms? No, they work everywhere. I just used WinForms as an example, but they work absolutely everywhere, and they can be in any file. It doesn't have to be in program. So typically what you would do, I think, is you probably create yourself one file that's like global usings.cs, and that's where you'd put them. And I think templates in the future will be doing that as well. So that's minimal APIs. I got a much more sophisticated example here that you can look at, but you get the idea. Once you have that fundamental ability, you can now do whatever you want, really. Let's talk about some other types of development. You've already seen me do WinForms. I just used that as an example so you see it. You could do WPF. Those are now supported as fundamental first-class citizens of .NET 5 and 6, including good designer support. And that's things like click once and so on. Before I move on, 2 questions online. Are these services Open API compatible, the minimal service? Yeah, they just create standard services. It's just a shorter syntax. So certainly the Swagger stuff is there. How do you deploy that? It's a standard ASP.NET Core web app. Basically, it's just simpler syntax in how it's set up. So you deploy it just like any other, and I could right-click publish, or more likely it'd have some continuous integration thing. And so absolutely that would all work like you've always known it to work. So Windows development is there as a first-class citizen. There's this thing that's kind of new called Windows App SDK. It's actually not really new if you've watched former or prior State.NET events. This is what Project Reunion used to be. This is now called Windows App SDK, which I personally think is a much, much better name. So the Windows App SDK basically takes all these different UI technologies that Microsoft has. WinForms, WPF, UWP, Xamarin, things like WinUI that comes from the Windows team and provides certain controls that you would usually use in a UWP app. WebView, the ability to host the new Microsoft Edge Chromium control inside of your application. All those things and more are brought together and are basically now usable everywhere. So if you are using a WPF app, you can use these WinUI controls. If you're building a WinForms app, you can use WPF, you can use WebView, you can use WinUI, and so on. So all these walls that were put up that wouldn't allow you in the past to actually combine these different technologies. If you think back to Windows 8, it was specific where you were not supposed to use Metro components inside of a Windows app. Right? All those walls are now gone. It's all brought together. You just have this huge API that provides anything from WinForms up to UWP and WinUI 3, usable in any app. And if you watched last month's State.NET, where we did the build recap, I actually showed an example of a Windows Forms app bringing in that case, an Edge view control to host HTML and other things. So that's cool. Project Reunion finally growing up and being a key part of that. The web view control too, that is Chromium Edge, the new Edge browser from Microsoft. It's based on Chromium, the same as Chrome from Google, if you haven't seen that yet. Usable as a control inside your applications, which is super, super useful. You can use WinForms, WPF, all those types of things. Works in Windows 7 or later. You don't need to have Windows 10 or Windows 11. And there's now an evergreen version that ships with Windows 11. So on Windows 11, this will always be there, and you can just refer to it. So that's some nice news, and that's really useful to have. WinUI 3, I want to mention it here, but we talked about that before. WinUI 3 is the components, the controls, the animations, the fluid behavior of the controls brought to you by the Windows team is now part in this whole Windows App SDK environment and useful. So WinUI 2 is out, WinUI 3 is available as a preview, and will all ship with .NET 6. And then finally we get to Maui. Now, I'll say one thing right up front. I was hoping Maui will be a huge part of my presentation today. It is not. I did a sample of this last month. It was a little rough, and it's just still as rough. So I'm not doing a big sample here because this still needs some work. I do not recommend you use Maui today in your production apps, but come the fall, this will change a lot. So what is Maui? Maui is a continuation of the Xamarin Forms toolkit. So if you've used Xamarin before, it's a platform, a .NET platform to build for iOS and Android. And in the past, you could also do things like you could build a Mac app with it, or you could build a Windows UWP app with it. But those were not core scenarios. And when you watched how those templates evolved over time, really kind of the UWP thing fell by the wayside, and Mac was never that big a part of it. It's really Android and iOS. And with Maui, that changes. With Maui, this becomes one of the key ways of driving cross-platform apps. So this is a good way to build Windows apps, it's a good way to build Mac apps. You're literally building one project that has all of that in it, and the platform picks and chooses what's best. So chooses what's best. So if you are targeting Android, it'll use the Android controls. You're targeting iOS, it'll do that. But on Windows, it'll use UWP and WinUI 3 and all the stuff that's available as the app SDK. So it builds a real Windows app, but it's still cross-platform. It can run on the Mac, right? And then it'll pick the Mac controls to do the same thing. So just like Xamarin has always been, right, taking that and pushing it to the Macs and having access to the platform's native features. And so this will be super cool. Unfortunately, it's still so rough that I don't have a good demo today. But we'll surely dedicate a future version of a State.NET event to just Maui, because this is just super important. The other thing is Blazor. And again, we've done Blazor presentations in the past. We've had several State.NETs on Blazor. This is so popular. This was by far our most popular State.NET event we've ever done. So go back, check out the Blazor content that we have online. In short, this is Microsoft's latest web development framework. So when we talk about ASP.NET web development, by default, people seem to be referring to Blazor now and not MVC anymore, anything like that. Now we've talked about how Blazor is this thing that can run in the browser, client side. So there's this thing called WebAssembly. WebAssembly is a web standard that works in every browser, and it's a binary way to execute code. It's kind of parallel to JavaScript, if you want to think of it like that, or in a way JavaScript could and may one day even be based on top of WebAssembly. But one way or another, it's this way to execute binary code in the browser at almost assembly level performance. And Microsoft built a .NET runtime on top of that, which then takes .NET DLLs and does its semi-interpreted way of running it. Initially it was a little slow, now it's much, much faster in .NET 6. And so that's all very cool. So that's Blazor WebAssembly running in the client, and it can run everywhere, on Linux, on Android, iOS devices, Mac, and so on. But you can also do Blazor server-side. And in that case, the code all runs on the server, and the app that runs in the client actually communicates with the server. And it's almost like Update Panel on steroids, except it works much better because it uses WebSockets. So that's what a lot of people seem to be using. Now in .NET 6, we get yet another incarnation of this, where we can build desktop apps on top of Blazor. Okay, so you can build an app and then you can compile it into a true Windows app, and it then just runs the .NET code in that app. It doesn't do WebAssembly because it doesn't have to, because we already can run .NET code in these various environments. So that's coming. That's a new thing, and that's actually built on top of Maui, and we'll talk about the differences between those two models. So that's pretty cool. Again, way too big a topic to talk about today. Little rough yet, that last bullet point, so I wouldn't build any production apps on top of that yet, but we're only a few months off, right? So that's gonna be an interesting aspect there. So what were the updates? Again, I did presentations about that before. Move to this standard .NET 5 platform, better performance, and so on and so on and so on. So lots of cool features in Blazor 6. In Blazor.NET 5. In Blazor.NET 6, the cool new stuff is running on top of Maui in the desktop. So that's another option now. And what that allows you to do essentially is not look at Blazor so much as a WebAssembly thing anymore, but just as a really cool framework to build applications with. Because with Blazor, we really got two things. We got this ability to run in WebAssembly, but we also got this new web application framework that people really, really liked. So being able to build desktop apps with that rather than, say, Electron is certainly a nice additional option that we have. And another thing, there's little features in there, lots of little features. The two most significant ones in my mind is, first of all, error boundaries, which is a good way to do error handling and making more robust web applications. And the second one is just performance improvements. You can now do ahead of time compilation, a few other things that just make Blazor WebAssembly apps much more performant. So that's just for WebAssembly, not for desktop, not for server side. Those are already lightning fast anyway. So people say, well, Ken, so now you just told me about these two things. You got Blazor that I can use to build desktop apps. We got Maui to build desktop apps. Isn't that competing? Which one should I use? And yes, you're absolutely right. They are somewhat competing, but they're different models. Blazor desktop is for people that love building on top of HTML technologies and that whole stack. And they want to use CSS and all those web standards to build apps, and just also maybe want to build a desktop app. So Blazor is great for that, and it's nice to see that that development model can now be used on the desktop. Maui is approaching everything from exactly the opposite angle. It's building a native app using native controls, no HTML, CSS. It's just when you run on a Mac, you get the Mac controls. When you run on Windows, you got the Windows controls, and you get the idea, right? So at the end of the day, you're still building very similar things. Blazor being a little more cross-platform even because it can also run on Linux. But both ways you're building a cross-platform app. It's just, do you want to approach it from an HTML angle or do you want to approach it from a native angle? And then, of course, to make things a little more confusing, you can actually push either side a little bit further. So in Blazor, you can, in exceptional cases, bring in native controls. That's now also supported. So you're kind of dipping into the Maui model a little bit. And in fact, Blazor Desktop is running on top of Maui. Maui, on the other hand, can bring in hosted HTML through the WebView 2 control. So it mixes and matches a little more. But overall, you are approaching it, whatever you choose depends on, are you more comfortable with HTML or more comfortable with native app development? And people ask me, how popular is this thing? Is this here to stay? Is this going to be the next Silverlight? And I think that has been answered at this point. It's very, very popular, fastest growing Microsoft.NET technology ever. And I can say from our own experience, it's what we get the most inquiries about. It's what the most popular events are. So yeah, this is here to stay. It's now also being used as the basis for other things, like tying it into Maui and all that, which tells me this technology is not going to disappear anytime soon. So that's been established, but it's still relatively early in the release cycle. So it's it's not like I can point you at a huge web app that's been around for 3 years and using Blazor, because it just hasn't been around long enough. So as a question online, I have a UWP app in the Windows Store. If I want to update it and then rewrite it in Maui, well, you could, but you don't have to. You can continue with your UWP app and now use all of the Windows App SDKs. And now you can tie into all these new things because that's just now more open and you can push that into the Windows Store. So no need to rewrite, but you could. But if you have an existing UWP app, I probably wouldn't move it all to Maui, I think, unless you want cross-platform, right? If you want it to also run on the Mac, submit it to the Mac store, then you probably should. Okay, here is a slide I'm just putting in for your reference when you download this, just a bunch of other new things that went into ASP.NET Core. Other than that, I'm going to switch past this. And there's a few little things that are significant if you're interested in it, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. Like single file application deployment is a pretty cool thing to be able to do. ARM64 support, for those of you who need it, really important new feature. Now here's one of the things that's kind of nice. There's this .NET Upgrade Assistance which you can get from this URL. This is a command line based utility that you can step through and let it look at an older code base and then let it tell you, hey, can I upgrade this easily from say .NET 4.5 to .NET 6, and it walks you through it and it updates files and you can pick and choose what you want. So a cool thing, it's currently in preview. Take a look at that. It's on GitHub. This URL gets you to GitHub, so cool thing to have. And so question online is, when would I use WinUI versus Blazor Desktop or Maui for building an app? Well, WinUI I would use if I have something that's maybe more involved than I can do with a web app, and I'm okay with it being Windows specific, then I would use WinUI, or maybe I bring in WinUI in a Blazor application. You can do that. But I think the bigger question is Blazor versus Maui, and I hope I answered that question. It's really, what are you more comfortable with? And to some extent, do you need to support Linux, right? A Blazor app, not Blazor Desktop, but a Blazor app, like a PWA app, can support Linux as well, but not the desktop app. Another question is, what was the CSS page isolation mentioned? That's a really cool detailed feature. CSS page isolation means you can write CSS that goes along with an HTML page in Blazor, but the CSS only applies to that page. So if it runs in a bigger environment and you happen to use a name of a CSS style that only applies to that page, it becomes isolated to that page, and it just makes it much easier to create CSS styles that don't mess up things in the big picture. It's a very useful little feature. All right, now I want to wrap this up with talking a little bit about Windows 11. Windows 11, I guess technically it's not a .NET topic, but it's still very interesting for our purposes here. So what's Windows 11? Well, next version of Windows. But hey, didn't Microsoft say Windows 10 was going to be the last version? Yes, they did. Never happens that way. So there will be a Windows 11, and they just did a live event that showed some of the Windows 11 features. I personally really like it. It's a little bit of a refresh of the UI. It's, I mean, we've had these Windows 10 updates on bigger updates twice a year. And so in a sense, it's just a really big update like that. And maybe it's just marketing speak to call it Windows 11 versus Windows 10, whatever. But Microsoft chose to call it Windows 11, and it's a fairly big step in UI update. It's a fairly big step in also requirements for the platform, hardware requirements. Now, there was a lot of talk about a tool being out there that checked your hardware to see if it was compatible with Windows 11, and that tool turned out to be so bad that they pulled the preview version of that tool because it basically told most people that their stuff wouldn't run when it really does. But it does have a little bit of higher hardware requirements than Windows 10 does. But so check out the live event. Now, what's also very interesting, there's a what's next for developers in Windows 11. Much harder to find, so I put in the YouTube link here, so when you get the slide deck downloaded, this is the link you want. And that talks a lot about what's important for developers. So there's a lot of stuff we could talk about. The UI looks a little bit like this, much softer, rounded corners, nice milky glass effects, and just looks like a modern OS. I really like it. There's some controversial things in there, like the start menu moved to the middle, but you can change that with the settings. If you like a start button in the bottom left, then you can still do that, of course. But it's a nice overall facelift. All the controls changed a little bit, have this softer look, and animations and all the WinUI stuff automatically adjusts to that, by the way, when you run on Windows 11 versus Windows 10 gets the Windows 10 look. So that's really nice to have that. But there's a few specifically big things that I want to point out to you. there's going to be a new Microsoft Store. It replaces the Windows Store. This is going to be available on Windows 11, but also on Windows 10. So it's coming from Windows 11 and is as such a Windows 11 feature, but it's also more generic because it will be available on Windows 10. And this does one thing that I've been asking for the last 10 years. So I'm super excited and happy about that. And that is, it's a store for all Windows apps. Because to me, it was always borderline insane to say, we got this Windows user base. It's the world's biggest user base because Windows is the biggest, has the biggest install base for an operating system. Yet there was no store to get to those people to allow me to deploy my app unless it was a UWP app. And so this new store is for all apps. You can upload WinForms, WPF apps. You can do PWAs if you're building, say, an Electron or a Photino app or a Blazor desktop. Whatever it is, if it runs on Windows, you can upload it to this app store. So that's exciting because this will finally really allow me to get to my customers worldwide with everything I have for Windows. So that's cool. Another cool thing is that there's new commerce models. A lot of people say, well, would be cool, but I don't want to give Microsoft a cut of what I'm doing. Well, with this new store, the store experience is actually somewhat separate from the commerce side of things. You can use the Microsoft Commerce Engine, which will give you tools and marketing and all that sort of stuff. But you can also say, no, I have my own commerce engine. I want to charge for my app, but it's not coming through the Microsoft monetization engine. I'm doing my own charging for the app or I'm using a third-party charging platform potentially. And then I want to keep 100% of the money I take in, and that is now supported as well. Now that's huge. Think of all the other app stores that are out there, Apple, Android, Google, whatever. They all take a cut of what you're doing. Now on Windows you have an option where you keep 100% of your revenue. Now it's going to remove some features, right? It's going to not allow you to use the Microsoft statistics and you have to figure out a way to charge yourself and all that. But that's now available and you can still be in the Windows Store, or the Microsoft Store, I should say. Gotta get used to the new name. So that's cool. That's pretty profound in my opinion. Now another profound feature in Windows 11 is Android apps. Now this is something I have to say I really did not see coming because Android's very different. It runs on ARM and it's just a completely different environment. But you can now run Android apps directly on Windows. So here's the TikTok app, for instance, running on Windows 11, and it just works. And that works because there's a new Windows subsystem for Android. So similar to the Windows subsystem for Linux, WSL that's available and has been available for a while. There's now a new subsystem for Android, and Intel Bridge Tech is used to actually map to the ARM binaries, and it's completely transparent to the users. So Android apps just work on Windows now. And this is being served up by the Amazon App Store. So everything that's in the Amazon App Store will now be available for installation on Windows and come through the Microsoft Store, presumably. So that's interesting. To me, that's very profound. I think that'll have a big impact in two ways. First of all, I think it's going to make the Amazon Android Store much more important. So if you're building for Android, I would absolutely make sure that you're in the Amazon App Store as well. And secondly, it kind of changes the ball game in a way when you say, okay, I'm building a Xamarin app and I'm targeting Android. Well, that can now also run on Windows. And of course, Android apps can be very flexible in terms of the size they have. They don't need to be the phone format. And so that's, to me, much more profound than people seem to realize at this point, is that you can do that. So we'll see how that turns out, if the market will embrace that, but that could be a very, very cool thing, being able to run these Android apps. Question online, does the store support private inside company apps only? Yes, it should also support that. I have no experience with that myself, obviously, in the new store, but the statement from Microsoft is that it will support that. So that's Android apps, and then Marty, way over time again, like I always am. But one last thing I want to point out to you, a major thing, and that is MS Teams integration. Now, we talked about this in last month's State.net, where we talked about developing for Teams and how Teams is becoming a platform, an operating system in itself, if you will, where you work together in groups of people and you can build apps on top of that and integrate your apps. So I encourage you to go back to last month's Stato.net recording and check out my sample where I build a sample within Teams. Well, Teams has now been elevated from this thing that Microsoft has to a core component of Windows. So this is going to be in every version of Windows. People are going to have access to Teams. And again, I think that's profound because it's making development for Teams even more interesting as a platform. So lots and lots of little things that are really fairly profound. Little things are happening too that are interesting for developers. We already mentioned WebView 2 Evergreen as part of Windows. Also, Windows Terminal is now going to ship just as part of Windows, and you don't have to install that. So Windows 11 will keep us busy for a while. I'm sure we'll do another event just on Windows 11. In fact, we got it tentatively planned as the topic for next month's Stato.net, kind of a deep look at Windows 11 for developers. We call it tentative because we got to see how the builds work and make sure we have something really good to show. But that's what's tentatively scheduled for July's Stato.net event. So sign up for that. You'll be able to sign up for that later today. We'll open that up for signups. And that pretty much concludes the presentation for today. I have a few other announcements I want to show or repeat. Again, please fill out the survey. This really helps us. We'd like to know what you like and don't like about these events. We'd like to hear from you what other events you'd like to know in the future. So you'd really help us out by filling out that survey, and we're giving away $100, like we said. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, wow, this is cool stuff, I wonder how this applies to me. Should I worry about this Maui stuff? Should I use Blazor? How about C#10? How does that apply to my personal project? Well, feel free to contact us. We are doing this free hour of consulting. It's been very popular, so first come, first serve, but it's no strings attached. You don't have to give us a credit card or anything. Just set it up with Jim or send to info@codemag.com, and we'll, as much as we have availability, first come, first serve, but we'll set up an hour or so. We're not the kind of company that'll send you an invoice because it went 10 minutes long, right? So that's available. Code Magazine. We've talked about Code Magazine subscriptions. Code Magazine is almost certainly available to you for free. If you're a Microsoft customer, if you have a VSS subscription, what's formerly called MSDN subscription, or if you're even having the free Dev Essentials, you can get a free Code Magazine subscription. And in fact, if you don't have any of that, there was a link earlier in the slide template where Jim is giving out free subscriptions. So just go into the slides and click that link and you get a free subscription. Our Code Magazine app, iOS and Android app, is kind of a cool way to read Code Magazine. And we said while this COVID crisis is going on, we're making all our content free. That's still ongoing. We open our office back up. We don't consider the crisis done yet, though, and so this continues. Grab the app, get your free Code Magazine content. Again, next Stato.net event will be July 28th, likely focusing on Windows 11. Topic could still change, but the date is not, so definitely going to be July 28th, always the last Wednesday in the month. And that is pretty much it. I'll open it up for questions now. We have a few more questions online. One of them is there a plan, rumor, hope for a replacement or alternative to Crystal reports? I have not heard of anything, so that would really surprise me. Now, you do have the alternative would be the SQL reporting stuff, for instance. WPF has great document features. There's HTML output that you can send to PDF for printing, things like that, but I have not heard of anyone doing anything specific. That would be a Crystal Reports replacement, and I would be highly surprised if that happened. What will happen to Win 11 and Teams with Windows 10 and Skype? Not totally sure what the question is there. I mean, I guess Teams is a little different from Skype, but certainly in the same arena, I would say. But I'm not aware of anything happening to Skype specific with Teams. That, I mean, conceivable that gets merged in at some point, but I don't have any specific information about that. All right, I think that's it for the questions online. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. If you have any questions, I always tell people, feel free to consider us a resource. Again, we are a very community-driven organization. We are not going to send you a bill if you send us a question. We're more than happy to help out. So consider us a resource. Send me an email if you want, markus@codemac.com. I will admit I'm always behind on my email, so it's probably better to send it to Jim or to info@codemac.com so more people get involved, making sure your question gets answered, or they kick me when I don't respond in time. So I definitely try to respond to everything, but it's safer to send it to Jim and make sure that we get everything answered, but we do answer every email. So thank you very much for attending, and I hope to see you next time. I hope you get your free Code Magazine subscription. This is going to be available as a recording. The slides are going to be available for download. Point your friends at the recordings, at the slides, and we want to make this available to as many people as possible. So thank you very much, and see you next time.